My name is Lydia Miller. I am 34 years old, and I learned the hard way that the most expensive mansion in Boston can be the coldest place on earth during a blizzard. I stood on the snow-covered porch of my family's estate, clutching my 6-year-old daughter's hand as my grandfather looked through us as if we were stains on his expensive Persian rug. He didn't see the handmade gift she was holding, or the hope in her eyes. He only saw a threat to his pristine family bloodline. When he opened his mouth, the words were sharper than the freezing wind, declaring that Maya was not his great-granddaughter, and that we needed to leave his sight forever. I didn't scream, I didn't beg for warmth, and I didn't shed a single tear in front of the man who had just shattered a child's heart on Christmas night. Instead, I reached into my pocket and raised my phone, sending a single text message that would trigger a financial avalanche he never saw coming. Before I reveal the contents of that message and how I dismantled a billion-dollar empire before sunrise, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that an innocent child should never pay the price for a grown man's pride, please hit the like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Your support is the only thing that kept me going during the long, dark hours when I was fighting to reclaim what was rightfully ours. Trust me, the panic that followed my silent text was more satisfying than any shout could ever be, and you won't want to miss a single second of this reckoning. The snow in Massachusetts has a way of numbing your skin, but it couldn't touch the coldness I saw in the eyes of Silas Miller as the heavy oak doors clicked shut. Growing up as a Miller meant living under a microscope where every action was measured against the weight of a century-old shipping legacy. Silas was the patriarch who ruled the family with an iron fist, treating his children and grandchildren like chess pieces rather than human beings with beating hearts. I was always the rebellious piece on his board, the one who preferred the honesty of the Boston streets to the suffocating silence of his mahogany-lined study. 7 years ago, I walked away from the Miller fortune when I refused to marry the son of his business partner, choosing instead to build a life on my own terms. When I became a single mother, Silas viewed Maya's birth not as a blessing, but as a calculated insult to the pure lineage he spent his life curating. He had cut off my trust fund and scrubbed my name from the company directories, assuming that poverty would eventually bring me crawling back to beg for his forgiveness. My uncle, Caleb Miller, was the only one who kept in touch, playing the role of the sympathetic mediator while secretly whispering poison into Silas's ear to secure his own position as the sole heir. Caleb was a man who traded his dignity for a corner office, constantly reminding Silas that I was a liability who would only bring scandal to the Miller name. I spent those years working 2 jobs in the city's financial district, building a career from nothing, while Silas lived in a mansion built on the labor of the people he looked down upon. Maya grew up knowing only the warmth of our small apartment, unaware that she was the direct descendant of a man who owned half the docks in the harbor. I had hoped that time would soften the jagged edges of my grandfather's pride, especially since he was reaching an age where legacy should mean more than bank balances. When Caleb called me a week before Christmas, claiming that Silas was ill and wanted to meet his great-granddaughter before it was too late, I wanted to believe that family blood finally mattered more than old grudges. I packed our bags and drove through the worsening storm, telling Maya stories about the magical Christmas tree in the grand hall of her great-grandfather's house. I wanted her to feel like she belonged to something bigger, to have the family history that I had tried so hard to escape but eventually missed for her sake. We arrived at the gates of the estate, feeling like travelers returning home, but the atmosphere inside the mansion was devoid of any festive spirit or genuine welcome. Silas sat in his high-backed chair, surrounded by the shadows of the past, while Caleb stood behind him like a vulture waiting for a carcass to drop. The air was thick with the scent of pine and expensive scotch, but there was a distinct lack of laughter, or the kind of joy that usually accompanies a holiday reunion. I realized too late that the invitation wasn't an olive branch. It was a stage set for a final, cruel performance that Silas had been rehearsing for months. He had invited the city's most influential lawyers and socialites to witness my return, only to use me as a prop in a display of his absolute authority. Caleb's smug expression told me everything I needed to know about who had really orchestrated this gathering, but I kept my head high for Maya's sake. I had walked into the lion's den thinking I was entering a sanctuary, forgetting that Silas Miller never did anything without a cold, calculated motive that served his own ego. The invitation to Christmas dinner felt like a white flag, but walking into that dining room felt like stepping into an ambush designed to humiliate us in front of Boston's elite. The long mahogany table was set, with heirloom silver and crystal that caught the flickering light of the fireplace, creating a scene that looked like a holiday postcard. However, the guests were not family friends. They were the board members of Miller Shipping and the Thorne family lawyers, all watching us with a clinical curiosity. Silas sat at the head of the table like a king on a throne, his expression unreadable as Caleb Miller hovered near him, pouring wine and laughing at jokes that weren't funny. I sat Maya down in a chair that was far too large for her, trying to ignore the way the other guests whispered behind their silk napkins about the illegitimate branch of the family. Caleb began the evening by making a toast to the purity of the Miller legacy, his eyes lingering on me with a predatory gleam that made my skin crawl with discomfort. Silas didn't speak to me once during the first 3 courses, instead directing all his questions to the lawyers about the new amendments to the family trust. Maya tried to be on her best behavior, her small hands carefully using her fork as she looked up at the portraits of our ancestors lining the walls. She eventually reached into her bag and pulled out a drawing she had spent weeks perfecting, a colorful depiction of a ship named after her great-grandfather. She stood up and walked toward the head of the table, her face glowing with the innocent hope that a simple piece of paper could bridge a 7-year-old canyon. Silas didn't even look at the drawing. He kept his gaze fixed on the wall behind her, as if she were a ghost that he refused to acknowledge. The room went silent as Maya reached the edge of his chair, her small voice asking if he liked the colors she had chosen for the sails. Caleb let out a sharp, mocking laugh that shattered the silence, commenting on how some people think they can draw their way back into a billion-dollar inheritance. I felt the first spark of real anger igniting in my chest as I realized that Silas had intentionally invited these people to witness the ultimate rejection of his only great-grandchild. He wanted to make it clear to the board and his lawyers that I had no claim to the empire and that Maya was a non-entity in the eyes of the law. The air in the room became suffocating, the smell of the roasted turkey and expensive wine suddenly turning sour in my throat. I stood up to retrieve Maya, but Silas finally spoke, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the ancient house. He told the entire room that a name like Miller was earned through loyalty and blood, not through unauthorized additions that lacked a legitimate father's signature. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up against the man who controlled their salaries and their social standings. Caleb smirked as he reached for more wine, clearly enjoying the spectacle of my daughter being treated like an intruder in her own ancestral home. I realized then that my uncle had convinced Silas that Maya was part of a long-term scheme I had hatched to steal the company from under him. The dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was a public execution of my daughter's right to belong, conducted with the cold precision of a corporate merger. I walked over to Maya and took her hand, feeling the tremors in her small frame as she began to realize that the man she had drawn for was not a grandfather, but a stranger. It's one thing to hate me for my choices, but watching an 80-year-old man stomp on a 6-year-old's drawing is a different kind of evil that I couldn't ignore. Silas Miller rose from his chair with a slow, deliberate grace, his shadow looming over Maya as she held out her colorful ship drawing one last time. Without saying a word, he snatched the paper from her trembling fingers, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the innocent lines of crayon and ink. Before I could reach her, he crumpled the drawing into a tight ball and dropped it onto the floor, his heavy leather boot grinding it into the expensive hardwood. Maya gasped, her small body crumbling into a silent sob as she looked down at the ruined gift she had spent so many nights working on. Silas leaned down until he was inches from her face, his breath smelling of aged scotch and old bitterness, and told her that her presence was a stain on the Miller name. He looked at me with a cold, triumphant sneer, and declared that since I had chosen a life of commonality, I could go back to the gutters where I belonged. Caleb stood by the fireplace, nodding in approval as he told the guests that Silas was merely protecting the integrity of the family trust from fortune hunters. The room remained silent, the wealthy socialites and powerful lawyers staring at their plates as Silas pointed a bony finger toward the front door. He told us to get out into the blizzard, stating that he wouldn't allow that child to spend another minute under a roof built by men of actual character. I gathered Maya into my arms, feeling her hot tears soaking into my sweater, and looked at the man who shared my DNA with a clarity I had never felt before. I saw that his wealth hadn't made him a king. It had made him a prisoner of his own arrogance, surrounded by sycophants who were only waiting for him to die. I didn't argue or plead for her to be allowed to stay warm. I simply walked toward the door with a silence that seemed to unsettle even Caleb for a brief second. As we stepped out onto the porch, the freezing wind of the Massachusetts storm whipped around us, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice in that dining room. Silas stood in the doorway, watching us descend the steps, and shouted one final insult about how Maya was not his great-granddaughter and would never see a cent of his money. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the snowy night like a final judgment on our relationship. We reached the car, and I sat Maya in the back seat, wrapping her in every blanket I could find, while the heater struggled to fight off the winter chill. I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion, seeing the silhouettes of the guests returning to their dinner, as if they hadn't just watched a child be discarded like trash. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out an old, dented tin box that I had carried with me since the day my grandmother passed away. Inside were documents and a private phone number that I had promised never to use unless the family's cruelty finally outweighed their humanity. I realized that the purity Silas was so obsessed with was about to be his ultimate downfall, and I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my heart. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of the storm that was about to erase the Miller name from the very city it had once helped build. Justice often hides in the places we least expect, like an old tin box buried under my daughter's broken crayons and the remnants of her ruined drawing. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine idling as the wipers struggled against the mounting snow, and opened the legal folder my grandmother had given me on her deathbed. Silas Miller always believed he was the one who built the empire, but the truth was that my grandmother, Eleanor Miller, was the one who owned the land the docks were built on. She had come from a family with more wealth and history than the Millers, and she had been smart enough to keep her assets in a private trust that Silas could never touch. In the quiet of the car, I read the clause that Silas and Caleb had clearly forgotten or assumed was just a myth. The primary estate and the controlling shares of Miller Shipping were to be held in trust until the birth of the first great-grandchild. According to Eleanor's ironclad will, the moment Maya was born, Silas became nothing more than a temporary tenant and a minority shareholder with no executive power. He had spent 6 years treating Maya like an outcast, unaware that she was actually his landlord and his boss the entire time. The documents included a secret contact for Mr. Henderson, the only lawyer Eleanor trusted, a man who had been waiting for my signal to execute the final phase of her plan. I realized that Caleb had been so focused on Ninbur Silas that he hadn't bothered to check the foundational deeds of the family company. They were all sitting in that warm dining room, drinking wine and celebrating their victory, while the very roof over their heads was legally shifting under their feet. I felt a surge of adrenaline that pushed back the exhaustion of the night, my mind racing through the financial implications of what I was about to do. By denying Maya's existence as a Miller, Silas had effectively breached the terms of his residency in the mansion, which required him to act as a protector of the next generation. I looked at Maya in the rearview mirror, seeing her finally drifting into a restless sleep, her small face still marked by the path of her tears. I knew that I couldn't just take her away to a hotel. I had to show her that the world was not a place where bullies always won. Mr. Henderson had told me years ago that the power of this trust was like a nuclear option, something that would change the landscape of the Boston business world forever. I picked up my phone and dialed the number, hearing the familiar, steady voice of a man who had been the Miller family's legal conscience for 40 years. He didn't sound surprised to hear from me. He sounded relieved, as if he had been waiting for Silas to finally cross the line that would justify his removal. I told him about the dinner, the stomped-on drawing, and the eviction into the storm, hearing his breath hitch in anger on the other end of the line. "It's time, Lydia," he said, his voice as cold and sharp as the winter air outside. I looked at the mansion one last time, the lights still twinkling with a fake cheer that I was about to extinguish. I realized that Eleanor had seen Silas for exactly who he was decades ago and had left me the tools to finish the job he had started. I was no longer a disgraced granddaughter. I was the guardian of the heir, and the kingdom was officially under new management. I didn't raise my voice when he threw us out. I waited until the silence of the night to raise my phone and send the text that would change Miller history forever. The message to Mr. Henderson was simple and cold. "The breach has occurred. Handle them all, starting with the house and the primary accounts." I watched the delivered icon appear on my screen, knowing that halfway across the city, a series of automated legal triggers were being pulled in the middle of the night. Within seconds, the private servers of Miller Shipping would be locked down, and every corporate credit card in Silas's and Caleb's names would be deactivated. The trust had a morality and lineage acknowledgement clause that allowed for the immediate seizure of assets if the patriarch publicly disowned the rightful heir. I sat in the darkness, watching the mansion's exterior lights flicker as the security system began its transition to the new ownership protocols. I knew that inside, the wine was still flowing and the laughter was probably still echoing, but the foundation of their world was already gone. Caleb would be the first to notice when his phone started blowing up with alerts from the bank about unauthorized access to the family's emergency funds. I could almost see the smug smile disappearing from his face as he realized his platinum cards were suddenly as useless as pieces of plastic from a toy set. Silas would be next, finding that his private security detail was no longer answering his calls because their paychecks were now being issued by a trust he didn't control. I didn't feel a shred of guilt as I imagined their confusion turning into the same kind of panic they had inflicted on a 6-year-old girl. Mr. Henderson had prepared a team of forensic auditors and a private security firm that specialized in high-end evictions, all of whom were now on their way to the estate. The handle them all command wasn't just about money. It was about the total removal of Silas's influence from every aspect of our lives. I drove the car to the end of the long driveway, parking near the gate, to wait for the arrival of the legal storm I had just unleashed. I saw the headlights of 3 black SUVs approaching through the snow, the official marking of the Sterling Legal Group visible as they pulled up beside me. Mr. Henderson rolled down his window, giving me a somber nod that confirmed the process was irreversible and that the Miller legacy was officially under my daughter's name. He handed me a tablet that showed the live status of the company's accounts, all of which were now glowing with the account frozen status that would paralyze Silas's operations. The storm outside was intensifying, but for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I was standing in the eye of the hurricane, perfectly calm and in control. I looked back at the house and saw the front lights go out, replaced by the emergency red glow of the security override system. The panic I had promised was beginning, and the people inside were about to find out that the illegitimate chut they had kicked out was now the only person who could give them a place to sleep. I turned the car around, following the legal team back toward the mansion, ready to witness the moment when the king finally realized his crown had been stolen by the very child he had trampled on. The sun rose on a world that Silas Miller and Caleb thought they owned, until the police and Mr. Henderson arrived to tell them otherwise. I stood in the foyer of the mansion, Maya still asleep in the car, under the watchful eye of a trusted security guard, while the chaos of a corporate and residential takeover unfolded around me. Silas was downstairs in his silk robe, his face a mottled purple as he shouted at the 2 Boston police officers, who were calmly explaining that he was no longer the legal resident of the property. Caleb was frantically typing on his laptop at the dining table, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly knocked over a half-full glass of expensive cognac from the night before. He looked up and saw me standing there in my damp coat, his expression shifting from arrogance to a desperate, wild-eyed fear that was almost pitiful to behold. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, opening a leather-bound folder and reading the eviction notice that cited the lineage protection clause Silas had signed 40 years ago. Silas tried to lung toward me, but the officers stepped in his path, their presence a stark reminder that his name no longer carried the weight of the law in this house. The lawyers from the night before were long gone, having fled the moment they received the late-night alerts that their primary client was being liquidated. I watched as the private security team began the process of changing the locks on every door, the metallic clicking sound echoing through the grand hall like a series of final heartbeats. Caleb began to beg, claiming that he had always been on my side and that he was just following the old man's orders to keep his job. I didn't even dignify his lie with a response, instead pointing toward the door as the movers began to pack Silas's personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The handle them all command had worked perfectly. By 10 in the morning, the board of Miller Shipping had already held an emergency vote to recognize Maya as the sole beneficiary of the trust. Silas was being stripped of his title, his home, and his access to the wealth he had used as a weapon for his entire life. He looked at the ruined ship drawing that was still on the floor, now stained with slush from the boots of the police officers, and for a second, I saw a flicker of realization in his old eyes. He had lost everything for a moment of petty cruelty, and now he was being escorted out into the cold Massachusetts morning he had condemned us to. Caleb was forced to leave with nothing but his personal phone and the clothes on his back, his inheritance vanishing into the legal ether like smoke. As Silas reached the front door, he stopped and looked at me, his voice a pathetic whisper as he asked where he was supposed to go. I told him that he could go to any of the shelters his company had refused to donate to over the years, and I watched the door close on him for the last time. The mansion was quiet now, the only sound being the ticking of the grandfather clock that Maya would one day inherit. I walked back out to the car, feeling the weight of the Miller legacy shifting from a burden to a tool I could use to build something better. I woke Maya up, telling her that the storm was over and that we didn't have to leave after all. The architect of the family's ruin had finally cleared the land, and now it was time for the next generation to start the real construction. Standing in the ruins of my grandfather's pride, I finally realized that a true legacy is built on love and integrity, not on the cold control of a bank account. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings and corporate restructuring as I took over the management of the Miller Trust on Maya's behalf. I moved us into the mansion, not because I wanted the luxury, but because I wanted to transform that mausoleum of bitterness into a home filled with art, laughter, and genuine kindness. Silas spent his final months in a modest assisted living facility funded by a small, restricted stipend from the trust that didn't allow for a single luxury. Caleb disappeared from the Boston social scene entirely, his reputation so tarnished by the fraud investigation that no firm in the city would even take his phone calls. He eventually ended up working as a junior clerk in a town 3 states away, a fitting end for a man who had valued titles over the lives of his own family. Maya is now thriving, her bedroom walls covered in new drawings of ships, forests, and a family that doesn't need a pedigree to be whole. This journey taught me that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to make you feel small is to stand your ground and wait for their own weight to pull them down. Silas lost everything because he forgot that wealth is just a tool, and when you use it to hurt the innocent, it eventually turns its edge against you. To everyone who has stayed with me through this story, I want you to know that your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. If you are facing a family that chooses pride over people, remember that you have the power to create your own tradition and your own handle-them-all moment by simply refusing to play their game. I chose to forgive the past, but I will never forget the lesson I learned on that snowy porch about the difference between a house and a home. Family is the people who stand by you when the blizzard hits, not the ones who push you out into it to prove a point. My name is Lydia Miller, and I am no longer the granddaughter who was kicked out. I am the mother who ensured her daughter would never have to beg for a place at the table. Your support, your likes, and your comments are what allow me to keep sharing these stories of resilience and the search for justice in a world that can often be very cold. Please hit that like button if you believe in the power of the truth, and don't forget to subscribe so we can continue this journey together. I hope this story reminds you to cherish the ones who truly love you and to never let a bully's shadow dim your light. Before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stand up to someone you once respected? I'd love to hear your experiences as we build this community of strength and honesty together. Thank you for listening. And remember, the most beautiful thing you can ever build is a life you are proud of.